Benvenuti. Si sente? Emanuele, si sente? Benvenuti. È un grande piacere per me, in qualità di presidente di ACP, Art Capital Partners, Palazzo Franchetti, dare il benvenuto ai nostri ospiti. Gli architetti Alejandro Aravena, Ben Van Berkel e la Sheikh Karim Altani, che animeranno il talk a cui stiamo per partecipare, grazie alla moderazione di Elena Truria, per ragionare insieme sul tema di come i musei, proprio grazie alla loro progettazione architettonica, possono essere realtà attive nella nostra vita sociale e culturale e quindi sul ruolo più ampio dell'architettura nel plasmare il paesaggio culturale in cui si inserisce. La 18ª Biennale, che sta prendendo il via in questi giorni, è diventata un'occasione preziosa per noi di ATP, per offrire molteplici riflessioni sul ruolo dell'architettura nella nostra contemporaneità. Questo talk si inserisce infatti come incontro collaterale della mostra Building a Creative Nation, che ospitiamo al primo piano e che, se non avete avuto ancora il modo di visitare, oggi, prima di questo incontro, vi invito a farlo al termine della nostra chiacchierata. La mostra si offre come prima occasione internazionale di studiare e approfondire 5 nuove sedi culturali sviluppate dai musei del Qatar, con il coinvolgimento di studi di architettura di fama mondiale. Un'occasione importante per vedere da vicino la nuova generazione di istituzioni culturali del Qatar, che rivelano chiaramente come questo paese si stia impegnando per incentrare proprio sulla cultura la propria definizione. Oltre alla mostra appena citata, i musei del Qatar hanno inoltre l'importante ruolo di main sponsor dell'esposizione dedicata all'architetto giapponese Kengo Kuma, che ospitiamo al primo piano nobile e nel giardino. Un doveroso ringraziamento va per questo alla Sheikh Al-Meya bin Ahmad Al-Thani, con cui si spera di essere solo al primo capitolo di una lunga e importante collaborazione per i numerosi progetti che realizziamo qui a Palazzo Franchetti. Lascio adesso la parola a Elena Truia, Senior Advisor for Academic and Cultural Affairs of Qatar Museum, che si occupa di strategia educativa, di ricerca nel campo dell'istruzione, di diplomazia culturale, di affari culturali e di collaborazione interistituzionale. Sarà lei a introdurre più nel dettaglio i nostri importanti relatori. Grazie.
Grazie Roberta. Signori e signore, benvenuti. We will now switch to English, and I have a pleasure of introducing our panel today. In the middle is Alejandro Aravena, who is an architect known for his socially conscious and innovative approach to architecture. He is the founder of the architectural firm Elemental, which is dedicated to addressing social and environmental issues through design. In 2016, he was the director of the Venice Architectural Biennale. Aravena is a recipient of the Pritzker Architectural Prize, one of the highest honors in the field, and has been recognized for his work in social housing, public space, and disaster relief. He has taught architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, at the Istituto Universitario di Architettura di Venezia, where he also completed his graduate studies in theory and art history, and at the Architectural Association in London, as well as at the London School of Economics. His designs prioritize functionality, sustainability, and affordability, and he has been praised for his ability to bring together community stakeholders and incorporate their input into the design process. Aravena's work serves as a model for architects seeking to make a positive impact on society through their designs. Thank you. On the other side is Ben van Berkel, who studied architecture at the Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam and at the Architectural Association in London, receiving an AA diploma with honors in 1987. In 1988, he and Caroline Boss set up the UN Studio, an architectural practice in Amsterdam. Current projects include the STH-BNK by Boylach, mixed-use development in Melbourne, the Chamartin Station master plan in Madrid, 4, a large-scale mixed-use project in Frankfurt, and the Vassal Tower in Dubai. The UN studio, with the UN studio, he has realized, amongst others, the Mercedes-Benz Museum in Stuttgart, Arnhem Central Station in the Netherlands, the Raffles City mixed-use development in Hangzhou, the Canaletto Tower in London, and the Singapore University of Technology and Design. Ben has lectured extensively around the world. At Harvard University Graduate School of Design, he leads a studio on health and the built environment. He's also currently the IE School of Architecture and Design Mark Thesis Chair. In 2017, he gave a TEDx presentation about health and architecture. He was also a member of the Task Force Team Advisory Board Construction Industry for the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs. Welcome. And finally, my dear colleague, Sheikha Reem Al Thani is the acting deputy CEO of exhibitions and the director at Qatar Museums. She leads a comprehensive team of museum professionals, which services all museums and galleries under the QM umbrella. Sheikha Reem also oversees the development and implementation of QM's expansive exhibition schedule that brings world-class programming to Qatar and introduces Qatar's culture and emerging art scene to the rest of the world. Most recently, she has overseen the development of several successful exhibitions, including Forever Valentino, Dior, Designer of Dreams, Jeff Koons, Lost in America, Cause, He Eats Alone, Making Doha 1950 through 2030, Contemporary Art Qatar in St. Petersburg and Berlin, and Picasso Giacometti in Qatar. Sheikha Reem is also an adjunct professor teaching exhibition design at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar and has served on the board of InQ Enterprises. She has 13 years of experience in museums and exhibitions. She's also a multidisciplinary designer who works on activating space through a human approach to design. She graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar with a double major in interior and fashion design, and went on to become the first Qatari to hold a master's degree in design in adaptive reuse interior architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design. Thank you, and welcome to all of you. And I would like to just to give all of you a little bit of an overview, because this talk is organized in the context of the exhibition that you can see on the first floor, and I hope if you have not, you will do so after this talk. But it is also about a larger vision of what culture can do for society and for human development. And Qatar has been actively building museums and investing in creative and cultural industries. And in the past years or so, Museum of Islamic Art, Mathaf Arab Museum of Modern Art, New National Museum of Qatar, Qatar Sports and Olympic Museum have been built along with a host of galleries and art hubs around the city, such as Fire Station, Al Rivaq, M7, Liwan Center, Gallery in Qatar, and so on. And today we're here to see 5 more upcoming projects which are showcased in this exhibition upstairs. 4 of these are museums, and 1 of them is a school for design and the arts. So my first question goes to Sheikha Reem. Why is Qatar focusing on building museums? What is the reason and the vision behind this enormous cultural enterprise?
Thank you, Yelena. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So it's a very interesting question, but it brings us back to the history of, you heard Yelena say the new National Museum, because the National Museum in the 70s was the only museum in the Gulf. And it's the first museum in the Gulf to be created, which closed in the 90s. And we had no museums at that point until we started opening again with the Islamic Museum in 2008. So this puts us in 2 positions where we're not really a documenting culture, but we had a museum, so we saw some value. But where does the documentation come from, or where do we preserve our own history, our own understanding, and looking towards the future and what we need, which you'll hear a lot about also with both Ben and Alejandro about future projects. So Qatar has a huge vision to build museums in the cultural field, both the creative and the cultural field, for our diversification, for our understanding of the past, but also how do we connect with our futures. And I would like for all of you to go upstairs and take a look, because it's a comprehensive exhibition that really does discuss our timeline plus all our new projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now turn to our architects, and we want to learn a little bit more specifically about your projects. Alejandro Aravena is the author of the Art Mill Museum, and Ben van Berkel is the designer of the Dadu Children's Museum in Qatar. So I will give you the floor now to present the museums, but I would like to also pose Alejandro a question before you start talking about the Art Mill. And that is that since in Qatar, architecture is seen as a strategic tool for achieving fundamental nation-building objectives as it builds for its future. I'm curious to learn, you have won the competition for this museum, and it would be interesting to a little bit discuss the brief and also how you understood the purpose of your design in the larger framework of Qatar's cultural mission.
Working? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to try to answer the question with the project. The location, as you see, I don't know if you're familiar with Doha. The Islamic Art Museum by Ioming Pei there, Jan Nouvel's National Museum, and then the Art Mill, as it is currently, now has been recently during the World Cup was open to the public. So the first thing is that Doha is changing the sea line, making it become a public space. It wasn't the case before. It was close to production and industrial activities. So there's a huge transformation of the city, and happens to have to be through museums. So this is a museum triangle, this is a public promenade, the amount of people that go out there to mingle, to meet each other. So I would say that that has had an impact on the design, giving at least half of the square meters are not museum, but public space. And you may not be even interested in the galleries, but you go to meet others. And that's a very important part of the project. This is a slide we did during the competition, and I think that this may have been the moment, it is a completely subjective, where we won the competition. This is just a wild guess, because when we entered the competition, we ourselves wanted to understand the scale of the project. So we were not sure, is this a big building or a small city? And the same question was presented to the jury. Actually, to understand ourselves, we did the comparison. On the left is the Art Mill site, and at the same scale is the Tate in London, Venice Biennale, and the Kunstverein in Germany. All of them industrial facilities that had been transformed into cultural spaces. But take a look at the size of the Tate. So you immediately understand that even if the building is big, it has to have a city. And the project is a creative village aside to the city. So it's not just a collection, which is fantastic, but the creative industries of Qatar that will be in the most prominent space of the city. So I guess that from there, you already understand the goals of the nation that we are trying to translate into a physical form. When I'm done with the 6 or 7 minutes, you tell me, and I can stop. There's no problem. We're not starting from scratch. That is also part of the things. And Qatar and the history may be recent, but it's very valuable, and we didn't want to start from scratch. So the first thing we did was a survey of the existing mills and asked ourselves, how many of them can we keep? For sustainability reasons, embedded energy is already there, but it also adds some character to the building. But take a look at the space. I mean, these silos, and that's hence the name, for the different purpose, but it provides one of the most spectacular monumental spaces, even though the intention was not aimed for that. But that's the crossing space. Actually, the logo of Qatar, the Art Mill Museum, is coming from that space, from the silos. And it's good that you don't start from scratch. And we ask ourselves, okay, if those are the silos at the beginning, can we use the same silos as the DNA for a whole design? So we made, with that, let's say, element, we wanted to conquer not only the peninsula, but the environment. Actually, our question was, and being the environment a very tough one, can we domesticate this environment by introducing shade without having a roof? This forest of columns, which is a hypostyle hall, is an old architectural strategy. It provides, through the mass, and we just introduce some more air in between the columns so that the space in between could be that domesticated public space for the public life, for people to meet in the shade with a couple of degrees less. As you see, some of them may be used inside as these very spectacular spaces for displaying art. Some of them are used for ventilation purposes, like the old wind towers. So there's an environmental strategy in allowing hot air to abandon the system. And in addition to the silos, we have this kind of slightly sloping area in the length, though we are creating a new topography in front of the West Bay of Doha, which is rather spectacular. For the creation of that environmentally domesticated space, the other strategy was to take advantage of this more detailed, the air going through shaded spaces. That is, again, is a tradition, there's a lot of knowledge embedded there. And by keeping existing structures with embedded energy, plus the new mass shade in between the columns, plus this, with these three elements, we wanted to add to the national identity. It's starting from what was already there. Actually, the footprint of Old Doha was used for the footprint for the creative village, where you see that the proportion between mass and the open space, it's very pertinent for domesticating the environment. So again, it's not just a nostalgic operation, but pure wisdom accumulated after layers that we wanted to use for the building. Exploring also materials, we want to scout Qatar for taking different samples of the local earth, the different chemistries that add to the color, and become the material of the building. So again, from that you go to sketch some possibilities of how this could look like. And the current version, we have just finished concept design some years ago. And again, here you see this forest of columns plus the sloping platform where the creative village is going to be. Night use of the building is very important in Qatar because of the environment. So buildings are used twice, much more than in other parts of the world. You see children playing in the park when the sun is already gone. So looking at the 24 hours of the building was another of the things that we were not used to, that we learned while there. And again, we hope to add to the museum triangle, plus the project in between by field operations that will be connecting the whole area. Again, the transformation of this industrial facility into a new public and cultural space. And again, going through the park with pertinent species, Vogt landscape architects are working on the ecology, more on the land than on the landscape, understanding the local species, how nature works, to have that nature forces playing on our side, instead of just planting new stuff. Some of the towers will be also observation platforms. the Dow Center, again, the sea is another. I mean, one of the difficulties of this project is that it does not have a backside. It has fronts on all sides. So where do you resolve the technical back of house? That was a challenge. And so the sea and the water is another front. It adds to the richness, but it didn't make our life easier. Outdoor spaces, as you see. And again, eventually during the night. And this is another strategy. Because we've never done a museum, that's another important thing. And we were choosing, it was a really bold bet by the jury and by the sheikhs, because eventually, not always, but eventually, when coming from outside, you make those questions as that are very stupid questions sometimes. So one of the things as an outsider, we were thinking about the museum, why they tend to be this kind of blind boxes. And in order to have a contribution to the public life, all of the programs of the museum that could work both to the internal part of the museum and to the outside were placed on the edges. So let's say an amphitheater, a theater, the school, the kindergarten, the cafes, the restaurants, all of them can work for the museum, but also for the public space when the museum is closed. So all the perimeters is kind of porous, not just from an architectural point of view, but also from a programmatic point of view. Residence for artists as well. As you see, this is a machinery for the creativity, not just for the works. Some images of the galleries. The natural light, this is a luxury. And some of the interventions in the old silos where we need to achieve some slightly bigger room space beyond the 8.4 meter diameter of the existing silos. And that's a sense of what we were aiming to do with the museum.
Yes, thank you. So yes, I've had the opportunity to design, instead of that what Alejandro said, to design more museums, but to design a children's museums is something special, I can tell you. I had done so much research before on what it is to design for children. What is, you know, for instance, I've been involved in objects, playing objects for children, where with, for instance, a firm like Alessi, we designed the Doraf, an object what is not a dog, but it's also not a giraffe, but it is a combination of the two, and it plays with two worlds. And while I've designed that object and saw children playing with it, I came to the idea that it is so important to look at the way how children play and how they enjoy learning through playing. And this museum, the Dadu Museum, is based on the building blocks of learning, how children learn. And of course, they don't learn by themselves. They learn what I call by the way through body language and body play and body engaged knowledge, you could say, in a way what is unusually creative. And this is what we introduced in the design of this children museum, whereby the building blocks and the turning of the building blocks are a play of different galleries and gathering spaces, where almost the architecture symbolizes and stimulates the children, and of course the families who are coming there with the children, to use architecture as an example of how it can be seen as an element of play and joy to stimulate knowledge. And in in this wonderful site we have in the park, what is actually quite a little, yes, quite higher than the rest of Doha. You can have a wonderful panorama over the rest of the city, but also what is quite beautiful, you can see from afar this children museum being part of the city, because as the client was saying, this is not only a gathering space for kids alone. It's a community building project whereby children and families could come there, of course, out of Doha, but hopefully also out of the region, but also out of the rest of the world, to gather here and learn about how you can educate and stimulate the joy of learning. And of course, through the building blocks of learning as a first inspirational model, we were interested in how, through gravity and physics and geometry and the way how you, with spatial relationships, could introduce an instrument for knowledge, as I said. The way how you could work with recognizable forms in a cabinet or in a combination whereby play could always create sometimes a little bit of chaos, but children always find and again order in this complexity. So the Dadu Museum is also, for that reason, a platform for the way how knowledge not only is educated and stimulated for children here, but that it becomes a platform for the community to exchange for different generations to come, the way how you educate children. So as you can see in the design of the museum, building blocks are intersecting with each other. They are so combined that through the surfaces, the spaces and the volumes, we were able to create in-between spaces where light could come through these volumes, and that the light would guide you and direct you in a very natural way through the museum. So in a way here, the wayfinding is not done by many signs in the building. You can't find in this museum a lot of signs. Children and, of course, the families have to discover how to move through this museum as a non-linear process, like maybe this element of play is also part of this process whereby you don't start from A to B and then go to C. And that is done through a central gathering space, you could call it a central square in the building, where you could always jump from one gallery to the other, whereby you don't linearly move from one to the second to the third gallery in one go, but you can move easily and flexibly from one space to the other. And also you can then, from the central space, you can move out to the terraces and the gardens around the museum. But it is introduced in such a way that the openings and the light through the openings and the windows who are created by the volumes are giving you glances of why and how you have to walk where. And then, of course, you can come into these gardens, but the gardens are as educational and open and inviting as the exhibition spaces. The botanical aspect of it, where you can learn from local plants and trees, is part of the educational and playfulness of how children can learn from their local landscape. And here similarly, maybe as what Alejandro said, is that we were highly inspired by the history of villages and the history of Doha itself, through the way how families and children were playing in the courtyards, and children were safe there. They felt safe because they knew that the fathers and the mothers were in the houses, but they could always view the children. Or that they could walk through the streets with the family, of course, and then meet multiple families in a gathering square in the middle of the village. So that was the major inspiration of this gathering space, so that you could meet and gather there and maybe discover your friend who's also in the museum, or meet new friends. But through this gathering space, as I said, and through colors and light, you can move from one gallery to the other, as I mentioned. And the galleries are very simply organized through topics around health, for instance, or sustainability. So the education of sustainability and, of course, our environment are key today, or values around the way how the heritage, the history and culture, and yeah, everything to do with the way how, let's say, we live today is then part of another thematic aspect of this educational aspect of the museum, or literacy in one other gallery, what is introduced there as a theme to inspire. And what I forgot to say, of course, if you enter the museum, you have, of course, an entrance for the schools where a lot of children can come as well through another entrance. And what we have learned from, that's maybe what I've learned from other museums, the guidance of the amount of people coming to a museum. For instance, from art museums towards even brand-oriented museums like the Mercedes-Benz Museum, we had learned that over the time people can grow, or the public can grow and visit these museums longer or more intensely than one can expect. So for that reason, wayfinding, but also organizational strategies need to be studied very well, of how you clockwise bring people here to the museum, and that was done by making sure that there is so much to be seen that you, let's say, after 2.5 hours, of course, have to take a break, and that maybe sometimes you could not then see everything of the exhibition, but hopefully then also come back to the museum. And the most important is that, of course, the development of the design is going to be further refined through the exhibition spaces over the next phase, and particularly what we did quite nicely is together with the client to bring in also cultural features within the architectural experience while you visit the building, like the peeling and revealing of the facade is part of the work we did with Daniel from Snark Architecture, and actually there we've also believed that in this approach towards culture and societal aspects of the way how children learn brings them more together than any other aspect what we can expect from a children's museum. And I think I talk longer than 6 minutes, so I stop here and maybe bring it to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Both of your presentations are fascinating, and I think what is obvious is that, and I'm sure that the audiences recognize this, that you're situating your museums within the latest narrative of museums, whereby museums are becoming much more focused towards the audiences and engaging the local population rather than towards collecting and objects themselves. And in addition to that, another feature that is common to both projects, it seems, is that both of you are very much inspired by heritage of Qatar, and at the same time you're translating it into very modernist forms. So I'm curious to ask a little bit more about that. How do you balance these two things? How do you see them? What kind of interplay do you see there? And also, how do you think your project will change the face of a city? How will they influence the identity of the city? Dadu is situated, unfortunately this photo does not show, but it's really on a nice hill, and it's seen from all over the city. It's striking location and a striking building, very unusual. And Art Mill is basically a small city in itself. So what do you expect this to change for Doha? Do you expect to see more neighborhoods emulate this context? Because these are literally small ecosystems. You can almost spend the whole day and you don't need anything else. Everything is in one area. So is this a sort of a return to the city, to the village life, a modern return to the village life, or something else that we're witnessing? Alejandro, you want to start, and then we can move.
So let me. It's heritage is one thing, but I would also say it's just common sense. Sustainability is nothing but the rigorous use of common sense. If you're in a weather like Qatar, like in a desert-like country like Chile, and you make glass, you create greenhouse effect. So you would like to create thermal mass in the perimeter of buildings. When you put the mass in the perimeter, what you get as a consequence is that the structure is the architecture. And again, another notion of sustainability, if you're going to spend energy, hopefully spend it only once. When the structure is the building, when this building is going to be finished, when the structure is finished, the building is almost finished. You add very little to that. And that's another strategy that when you look at the environment, it makes sense. Common sense would have led you to that anyhow. So you're just reading or listening to what makes sense, and as a consequence, what you get are these things that are pertinent.
If I can just interrupt you, I thought I saw some features that are like cooling the interior, and these are the traditional methods of creating, bringing in cool air.
Absolutely, that's the adiabatic cooling. The drawing there is Transolar. We were not just an architectural team. We had a core creative team, as we called it, and Günther Vogt in the ecology, because the slope is taking water down, so there's moisture and there's more humidity down where we can that is more protected from the winds, and there we can expect the larger vegetation to grow. But then we have a mineral more plants and attitude toward the surface, so it's landscape. Then Transolar in environmental engineering, maybe the people that know the most, and that they're very wise in understanding the science of the place, not just, let's say, adding artifacts or machines. And then SBP, the structural engineers, they did many of the stadiums there. And again, the strategy of how to deal with the structure in a very efficient way combined as a synthesis is what that comes. As a consequence, the village life, we're expanding the public realm to touch the water. And the key question by when you achieve a sustainable public space that can lower the temperature, let's say by 15 degrees before applying any machine, is that you may expect to have more people coming. The size of the place makes that you're not using the same way the place all the time. When it's hot, you walk on the shaded side of the street. So maybe you go to the parts that are more with lush vegetation. But when you want to have a view and the weather permits, then you move to another part of the building. And we wanted this to be part of the dynamic of the building, because the question, and here I end, is not if people or to try to make people go to the museum. The key question is to come back to the museum. So you create that as a daily activity. The moment you create a daily activity, the notion of community, the notion of just looking at other people, not as a threat, but as somebody that I'm interested in, we as architects just create the background for that situation to take place in a very natural way, and hopefully to disappear in the corner of the eye so that life can take over.
Exactly, it's a community building exercise. Thank you.
So it's a really interesting question, because definitely from the vision for QM to actually be building these museums, whether it's around our collections, but also around our future. These are buildings that we're building for our future for hundreds of years to come. And having that look at what the passive architecture and vernacular architecture looks like for us, because people do have that wisdom of living in these areas before, and not what happened. Like we always have this thought, what would have happened in our architecture if the international style has not entered, where we have towers and the greenhouse effect. But I think this is very important for us to understand that opening a museum and working on a museum is not about the architecture alone, and it's not about this form or shape that is happening in the aesthetic. It is about this negotiation with both the audience and the collection and the institution to get, at the end of the day, a building and a space that allows for that interaction to really look what the future museums look like for us. And I think with these kind of architecture, both as building a new building completely, but also an adaptive reuse of an existing building, are really good examples of seeing that.
But yes, but what I like of the earlier question is what is it, what a true heritage and the history of how villages operated and cities operated in the past. How can that inspire contemporary architecture? Is an interesting question, or contemporary city making. And don't forget, we over the last years particularly have learned that community building is one of the key aspects of our culture where we have to work on. And don't forget that a lot of people feel quite alone in monofunctional areas. If you live in a monofunctional area, or if you're the whole day in the car, for instance, you don't meet people. You isolate yourself, and this is where. Actually, Doha is actually quite progressive to stimulate community building through cultural entities, to create cultural places within the city, and not only for its own culture, but also for an international group of people to come to the place to enjoy community building and to share ideas. I think this is actually also the great idea around, for instance, the metro line project where I worked on also myself. This was not an easy project to work on, but the ambition of the city was there to develop a metro system, not only pure out of infrastructural necessity, but the argument of the client was, no, people need to see each other. They need to meet each other. They need to be able to sometimes be together in one space where they even in a station could pray. And make sure that they don't isolate themselves from going from the house to the car to their work alone. And I think this is actually a highly progressive idea. And working with these principles, for me it was very easy to work on the Children's Museum, because for me and that was also a discussion of luckily enough of the client. It's not a Children's Museum alone. It's of course also for the fathers there and the mothers and for the whole family, so that that you create communal family communication within the city, whereby you know that it is actually there a place where you not only learn there for the children, but that you learn with families together of how you can stimulate knowledge, etc. So I think, I think it's a wonderful basic principle to work with in the way how you build cities.
Thank you. That's great. I wanted now to ask a sort of a practical question of Sheikh Karim. Since Qatar is moving its economy towards a knowledge-based economy, and these projects are certainly prime examples of how do you support human and social development. And as I mentioned in the beginning, it's dozens of museums almost are being built or are in the pipeline. Now, in the region, some other countries that have similar vision of creating the new cultural sector usually take museums from abroad, franchise them, and bring them in. Qatar has not taken this route. Qatar is doing everything from scratch. Every museum is connected to some strategy or a vision or an idea or a collection that is already in existence. So I would like you to comment a little bit on why is Qatar taking this approach. Wouldn't it have been easier to, import? And why is Qatar against this?
Interesting, yeah. So definitely we like to do things from scratch, homegrown. Again, we weren't a documenting culture, but we were a collecting culture. And this is something that was realized in the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s by the father Amir, the previous Amir, and built a cultural committee to look into this, to look at what collections we actually have, what collections are held by the public, and what is held by the government, and what is held in different contexts, and what are we creating with it. And from that, he assigned that mission, the bigger mission of our cultural field, to Sheikha Mayasa, who's our chairperson, who has been leading us for this whole time into presenting our journey actually in 3 phases. The first phase was about the national identity and who we are as people. So that included building the Islamic Museum, which looks at Islam from around the world, not just from the Arab region. Looking at Mathaf, which is Arab Museum of Modern Art, that used to be one of the first girls' schools that was in Qatar and has been turned by Jean-François Baudin into a museum. This collection had been collected for 25 years and of Arab art, which doesn't exist. There's only like 2 books that were written about it. So about Arab art and where we fit in within the landscape of art. But with the opening a museum like this, the rest of the museums around the world started realizing that they are missing a huge part of history that they needed to relook about for MoMA, for others that started purchasing actually artworks to make sure that their collections are sufficient compared to our collections. And then the last one in 2019 we opened was the National Museum, which does tell our full history from prehistoric time until the future actually, and what our future visions look like. Before we opened the National Museum, and myself included, did not learn about Qatar history. There was nothing called that. There was American history, there was British history that you learned at schools, but you didn't learn about your history because it wasn't documented. So part of the work that the National Museum did is to both for the oral history, but also document the full history of Qatar so we can be taught as history in classes, and this is what's happening now. It's exactly the same, and it correlates based on research that work that 10 years before the museum opens happens. It's not about the building, it is actually about the content and the context. That's the first phase, is about our national identity. The second phase that we're going into or went into is more about the community. So the sports museum, fire station, M7, so many different things that are looking at the creative fields and creative identity that is there. How do we bolster this? How do we provide opportunities? And the last but not least is social, which is for us with the art mill as well as the Children's Museum is what we're looking forward. You'll also see 3 other projects upstairs. One is the Auto Museum, because we are car collectors, so there will be an automotive museum designed by, will be adaptive reuse of one of our convention centers by Ram Koolhaus. There will be the Philip Stark Vocational School, because we really want to make sure that creativity and that craft is back, because it's something that has been removed from our region for a very long time now. And Lusail, yes. Cannot forget Lusail. Lusail is designed by Herzog de Meuron, and it's a new concept of looking at how we're being we were or are or will be represented in the world through the 19th century, from photography, paintings, and many, many others. And during the World Cup, we actually showed exhibitions for each of those museums, so everybody can come in and kind of understand the voice that we're saying, and that it has to come from us. It has to come from our people, what we want to say, what is our story.
Thank you. Yes, you have. I'm mindful of the time, and I think we have just the time left for 1 or 2 questions. So if somebody has a brief, succinct question to ask our panelists, please go ahead. Anybody? Yes.
Hello, my name is Speria. I am very honored to be commissioned to be the curator for the VCU anniversary exhibition in Doha this year in 6 months. So I'm a museologist and an architect, studying at the Bartlett Urban Regeneration also at the time where Bilbao was built and the Tate and so on. And I'm a museums person. I teach in Berlin and in Firenze, in Florence, and I especially teach social engagement in museums and galleries. And I don't really have a question, but just a comment here to say that as an architect and a museum person, I've never ever had architects talking of museums using the wording, semantics, semiotics that we use as architects describing a public urban space. And that is amazing for me, like describing a building in such a way. And I think that this is the essence of these projects, like totally opening the map.
Because you inspired me to actually ask this question. I'm also a member of the audience. To ask this question, considering that the museums are changing and are becoming much more open and more egalitarian and moving away from that image of an elitist, conservative guardian of the establishment that we've seen, not to mention all the other things that we've witnessed in museums in the 19th century. How is architecture contributing to that general transformation of the museum as an institution?
What I think is so interesting is that even the high-end art museums are luckily enough understanding that you don't bring a larger public to the museum if you are not open to the educational part of the way how you can talk about art. Like, for instance, of course I'm Dutch and I'm learning in my own city, Amsterdam, from the Rijksmuseum, that this museum opened up all kinds of new ways of bringing art to a larger audience, and also bringing, you know, not only elderly people there, but also children, to educate them about the way how art is made, how a picture looks like from the back, what kind of paintings are made underneath the painting, like in the latest Vermeer show. I don't know if you have been there, but it was a wonderful show where all the Vermeer work was gathered together in the Rijksmuseum. So many beautiful stories were told about the artworks that you know that it is not only guided towards one user group. And I think this is the future of the museum, that we think more about differential equality and social impacts of what the museum can do to a larger audience. So that, you know, we used to call it low art or middle, high, you know, of popular art, etc. But I think it's not anymore about high-end or low-end art or etc. But it is more about people. You know, how can we create a better community between culture, in a way, and the education of culture, instead of talking about art.
Does architecture have something to recommend to this general enterprise of building museums?
Yeah, but art can...
Do you have some solutions that, you know, are basically showing the way for museums, how they should be in the future?
Yeah,
are the architects the one changing the field, basically?
Luckily enough, I think that Alejandro said it as well. You know, we learn lately more and more that we get more investors coming to us and more clients who are understanding that architects are open to not only sustainable new ideas around the way how we can change, you know, climate change, etc., and make the planet healthy, but also think about social change. You know, I think that's a whole new development, luckily enough, in our profession. And architecture can help. Architecture can, through organizational devices, you know, we organize buildings, so we can, through organizational principles, we can communicate through a broader public. But it is a new aspect in our field.
I wouldn't say it's a new aspect, but I would say it comes a lot from the idea of the public sphere. What used to be there, the squares were the public sphere where people would come and gather and talk and converse, and then you had this like a lot of private spaces that started to come out where people did not feel that they could go as the public. You have to be invited to come in. And something for Qatar as well, we had that very much until the 2000s, where you would see spaces, people don't know, even from the sidewalk, whether they're allowed to be walking there or not. Is this a private space? But now making this and using the museum as a vehicle for this new public space for gathering is really what's important to us.
So I'm going to try to use a couple of images to answer the question. Yeah, well, many things were not said. But connecting the previous question, not importing a brand, but starting from scratch, well, that may be a philosophical choice, but also, let's say, a practical choice from the others. Because what do you do if you don't have a collection? You have to partner with somebody, and this is not the case here. The collection, we ourselves don't have a notion of the whole collection, but it's rather spectacular. So you can afford to do with your own stuff because somebody decades ago started to anticipate this moment. And that's a huge difference. In order to address the question of, well, I would say it would be absolutely arrogant if at least us will change the direction of museum architecture just only to, and then luckily enough, we were starting from a pre-existence. And one of the things, talking about standing the test of time, the other thing we said during the competition, and this may have been a very bold statement at the time, we were saying, we're here to try to make a building for the next 1,000 years. So once it's designed, and let's say in a century from now, looking at the building, you could say, but when was this built? In the 11th century or in the 31st century? We wanted that ambiguity to be there because in order to fight obsolescence, you have to go for timelessness. And not just from the design or a point of view, but also from a structural point of view. Then it makes sense that the structure is the architecture, it's environmentally pertinent, but mainly what we have learned from the architecture of the past. Who are the buildings that have stand the test of time? Take a look at where we are now. Those that we can't know what the future will be. That's why we can't reshape or redefine architecture. We have no clue what it will be. But we have to leave room for those that may have a clue in the future to change their minds and change what we thought today. So take a look at the structure of this architecture. Take a look, think about the Arsenale. They're so simple, so clear, so that the, let's say, rules of the game are so neutral, are kind. They're not trying to make their vision. The silos were not there to the author. We don't even know who did the silos, yet they're absolutely focused on delivering a performance of satisfying a need. The moment with the architecture you engage in that attitude of clarity, then the future can enter the system because it's simple enough. So, and this I'm going to add with this very nerdy thing, but the silos, sorry for this technical thing, but I think it's how we architect translate, at least. The existing silos, as you saw in the image, is a circle inside and an octagon on the outside, which is extruded. Extruded means that you take the shape and you bring it 35 meters high without changing. The problem with the silos that are functional for grain and for industrial uses is that it's hard to connect one to the next one. And in exhibition spaces, sometimes you need very big spaces, sometimes you need intimate spaces, and you need to have that flexibility that the industrial facility didn't have. So how do we introduce flexibility into the simple geometry of the silos? And take a look at the shape. Our proposal of the silo as a DNA is not the son of the silos or the daughter of the silos, it's a cousin. Let's say it's a relative. It starts as a square, and it ends as an octagon. When you have a square in the base, a square is a grid, so you can connect. The moment you create something that makes lives of future generation easier, then we have a better chance to stand the test of time.
Thank you. This is such a wonderful conclusion to our conversation, and thank you for a lively exchange. And thank you to our audience. We're delighted that so many of you came and hope to see you again. We will have more of these architectural talks at Palazzo Franchetti in the months to come. Thank you. Yes, and please do feel free to walk to the first floor where the exhibition is.